Welcome everybody. In this video, we're going to be learning about external authentication in ASP.NET Core. As you're going to find out from this video, it is all about OAuth. So if you haven't watched my video on OAuth and OAuth 2.1, go ahead and watch it. Video is in the description. We're going to go through an example of setting up external authentication of GitHub and as a consequence of looking through all of the externals of the authentication handler. And if you don't know anything about authentication handlers, go to the first episode in the playlist. My name is Anton. Welcome to the Raw Coding YouTube channel. Let's go ahead and get started. Here's our empty sample project. As I mentioned in my OAuth presentation, we first need to configure the provider which is going to be giving us authentication, right? We are some entity somewhere over there, and then the providers over here, they want to be giving us this authentication session. So we need to go over to them and they need to know who we are. In GitHub, this is how you do it. You go to settings, and maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger, but then you find developer settings and auth apps. Register a new application. So you go through this registration process. We then have a homepage URL. Let's say that we'll choose localhost that's going to reside at something like 5005. Okay, well, we'll copy this, and for now I'm just going to put it in the authorization callback URL as well. We're going to see what this is in just a second, and let's register our application. Here we have the client ID, and I'm not going to blur anything out because I'm just going to delete this all anyway. We'll copy the client ID, we'll come back to our application, and now to the builder, let's go to services and let's add authentication. So we're adding the base authentication services, and then we're going to add auth. This is going to be a GitHub authentication schema, and we're going to be providing some options. On these options, we will be able to set the client ID, okay? If you've ever attempted to set up any other external authentication like Facebook and stuff like that, the only things that you will need to provide is the client ID and client secret. For now, we're just obtaining a client ID and client secrets. So we generate a new client secret. There we go. Well, let's go ahead and grab that. And there we have it. So we, as a client, we have our credentials. Now we have to go over to GitHub. How does auth know to go to GitHub? Where on GitHub do we go? To answer these questions, you will have to find some kind of link to documentation, for example, like the OAuth documentation over here. And again, let me zoom this in, and this information is pretty apparent that you need this information. I explicitly point out that there is going to be two endpoints as part of auth that you need: the authorization endpoint, where you obtain your code, and then the token endpoint, when you exchange the code for the token. The first endpoint is the authorized endpoint. Let's go ahead and grab it, come back to the application, and let's look for this configuration. Here we have the authorization endpoint. Cool. Let's place this over here. So this is the first step out of 3 steps. So the first step is we go to GitHub, to the authorization endpoint to grab an authentication code. And again, if you don't understand this terminology, go watch the presentation. Here we will need to supply all the parameters, which the middleware will take care of, because remember, auth is a specification. All we have to do is follow the steps defined in the specification, which is what the middleware is going to do, and it's going to attach these automatically. We then want the users to get redirected back to our site. So they go to GitHub and then they need to come back. Where do they come back? This is the callback path configuration, right? So this is where GitHub is going to send them back. And wherever it is that they get back, they need to process the code and exchange it with the token endpoint. Let's grab the token endpoint. We're going to put it over here. So token endpoint equals to over here. The thing that I just briefly raved about, the callback path, we're going to omit it from the settings so we can see the errors, and that is just going to be a path for me to explore through the internals, okay? Again, all of the parameters will be attached automatically. We're going to get back a token, and finally, again, this is going to be something I'm going to talk about, how we exchange the token or the information which we're then going to inject into the claims principal. The user information endpoint is also part of the auth spec. Let's go ahead and stick this on the user information endpoint. Here we have the base information. Let's try to log in. We'll have login, HTTP context, CTX, and same as before, we'll just return a results challenge request. We want to challenge GitHub, and the signature in here is slightly weird. So authentication properties and multiple schemas. Let's cut this out, and then we have authentication schemas. This is going to be a new list of strings, where in here we want GitHub, okay? And actually not that interested in the HTTP context. We're going to use it for the default endpoint and just print the user. So let's place a delegate over here, and we will return context users claims. We will select all the claims into a new object. Again, remember the claim object does not serialize to JSON too well. All right, we'll to list this and semicolon over here. And there we have it, get user information and then attempt to log in through GitHub. The application currently is not running. One thing that I'm gonna say is coming over here, this is the location for my application. I'm gonna grab this URL, and I'm gonna go to launch settings, right? I'm not having a sandwich over here, we're doing auth. I'm gonna delete everything except the auth client profile. We are then going to replace all of the URLs with just this one. What this is going to do is when I .NET watch, this will launch my application on the appropriate port. Let's drop down the terminal, come back to the browser and open up the URL. And currently we're not signed in, so the claims are empty. Cookies are empty as well. Nothing is happening. We can now go to login, and the first error that we're gonna get is that the callback is not specified. The callback step is from the second step. So again, we go to GitHub. This is first step. We do whatever we do over there, input password, whatever. We need to be authenticated. We authenticate on GitHub, and then we are capable of reaching this endpoint. This endpoint is going to produce a code, and it's going to send us back to a callback path. The callback path is specified over here. If this sends us on the home endpoint, just the slash, we already have something mapped on there. What the auth service is going to do, and by the way, remember that this service is going to get executed before any of our endpoints. So use authentication will run over here before we reach any of the endpoints. In the auth extension, we register an OAuthHandler, which in its own right is an extension of the authentication handler. So the OAuthHandler is an authentication handler. Here we have handle remote authenticate async. This handler works slightly differently, where before we were taking a look at JWT and cookie authentication, we were saying once we reach this authentication middleware, it's going to load the authentication session from the cookie. What this is going to do is it's going to load the authentication session from the authorization code, and that is going to happen only once. So this authentication handler inherits from remote authentication handler, where the handle request async, which is going to handle the authentication, is going to first check should it handle the request. And it's going to handle the request only if it's going through the callback path. So throughout the lifetime of your application, you're going to be calling different endpoints. You're going to have many of them, okay? As you're calling all of these endpoints, all of the authentication handlers that you have registered are going to try to load some authentication session from a cookie, from a token, etc. The auth authentication handler is only going to attempt the loading if it's on the callback path. Remember, we are loading the authentication session from the code. So when we land on callback, we want to take the code and we want to exchange it for an access token, and then we use the access token to perhaps fetch some additional information from the user information endpoint. So this is how this works, right? If you've ever specified a callback path before and you were like, how does it register another endpoint on there? No, it means the authentication handler only runs on this path, okay? And what it's going to do is short circuit your call to that path and redirect you to the correct place in the end, right? So we have handler request. If this returns true, we should go ahead and try to load the authentication session. We're going to skip through all of this, but by the end of it, we will return you to the return URI, okay? So it's okay for you to basically say, callback path, anything. This can be anything. I'm going to name it auth GitHub CB. So auth GitHub callback, if I land on this path, the handler triggers. If I have the code, authentication should be successful. If I land on this path and you just randomly land on it, validation checks will run, you will fail, you may get an exception, you may just get redirected to an error page, okay? We want to make sure we take this path, we come back to our configuration and we tell GitHub, this is where you need to go. Let's update our application, come back to our website, and here we're already trying to authenticate. Let's come back over here and quickly go through the network tab just so people are aware of what is happening. If you want to do this yourself, make sure you have preserve log turned on. I'm gonna log in, and the first things that are gonna be happening is I'm going to my login page. This is going to go to the authorize endpoint. GitHub does not redirect you to some kind of internal login page because I'm already authenticated. If I wasn't authenticated, it would redirect me to the login page, and then I would end back on this authorize page at this consent screen. I'm going to authorize myself, and now we get the next error. And this is the biggest point where most people get confused, is that you need an additional authentication schema. When you come back with the code and the auth authentication handler gets triggered to go exchange the code for the token, come back with the access token, it does not automatically put the access token back in the browser or in a cookie. You need to create an additional authentication schema which can take the final claims principal and then store it in a cookie. So the auth authentication handler gets a code, by the end of which it will produce a claims principal, but it's not configured to either stick it in a cookie or a token or anything else or a database, etc. This is where you have to specify the mechanism for that. The way that you do it is we're going to add a cookie authentication schema. We're just going to call it cookie, and we're also going to set it as default. So when we're going through the authentication middleware, we will automatically attempt to load the user from the default authentication schema. Remember, this authentication schema only runs on the callback path when we land on it. And if we attempt to land on it without a code, so this will reload, the token is no longer valid, but let me go ahead and remove the code. Here we can see an exception that, we don't have correct parameters. Let's come back to our application because we haven't done the final linking. So we've added a cookie authentication schema. Let's grab this value. We now want to say that you should sign in with this schema, and we do it by specifying an option like this. Coming back to the browser, let's initiate another login. And now if you've seen there was a slight error of too many redirects. Let's clear the network tab, and we're going to try to authorize again. And you should see this network tab going slightly wonky here until we land on the authorize endpoint again. But essentially, we're stuck in an infinite loop. Why? Well, when we briefly took a look at the remote authentication handler, I said that we're gonna be going back to the return URI. It's contained in the ticket context. Where do we create the ticket context? Right over here. The return URI is set from ticket properties .redirect URI. The ticket is coming from the handle remote authenticate async, so we have the auth result over here. Finally, we're setting the ticket over here. We can keep tracing it, so from this auth result ticket, we're reversing through the code. So we'll come to the bottom of this method where we finally succeed, and I have a breakpoint over here. I'll remove it for now. If we will need it again, I will place it, but here's the final ticket that we're creating. We also have the properties, which is what we would expect to contain the return URL. Here we have an option for saving tokens. We can just disregard that whole block. Highlighting properties, so let's keep following the trail up until we land on here. Authentication properties get unprotected from the state. Okay, so this is important. Same as the cookie value uses the data protection API to take your claims principal payload, serialize it, and then put it in the cookie. And it's a little bit more than claims principal, as we will find out. But here the state parameter contains some information about the authentication properties. For this, we will find out if we go to program CS, and when we initialize the challenge, if we find the challenge async of the authentication handler, we will scroll down here and we will look for challenge something. We can use Control F, but here we have it. So handle challenge async, we have the authentication properties, which have the redirect URI. If it's not set, set the current URL. So if we're being redirected from the login page, we're going to come back to the login page. We don't want that. We want to come back to the home page. And the issue can be resolved by setting properties return URL, or sorry, redirect URI property to the place where we want to return after the callback path. So authorization, callback path with the code, and then redirect URI. If we take a look at this build challenge URL, we will try to take a look at the state over here where the properties get protected and get placed into the state. If we come back to the browser and we take a look at the redirect URI that we have here, so when we go to the authorize endpoint, we will see that the state right over here, this query parameter, it is present over here and it is maintained throughout the flow. So if we take a look at one of the previous requests over here, when we go back to the callback path, right? So we went to authorize, we got the code, and we're coming back to the callback path. Here we have the state. So essentially our authentication properties get persisted through that path of going through GitHub. And that is where our redirect URI is located. So that is how, if we go into program CS and over here, if besides the authentication schema, we will supply our authentication properties, so new authentication properties. Here, let me scroll down. We will specify the redirect URI, which should just be the home path. And for safety reasons, I'm going to say that this is localhost 5005. I'll indent this a little bit, and that should give us what we need. If we come back over here, and I don't know if I can back out into 5005, here I will initiate a login, and for the sake of it, let's just clear the network tab. We're going to log in. Here we're on the authorize page. We're going to authorize ourselves, and we're going to land on the home page. However, now the claims are empty. And does that mean we're not authenticated? No. We go to cookies and we can see the cookie that we have configured being set here in memory. So we are authenticated and we are capable of hitting this endpoint. It's just we don't have any claims. How can we actually set our claims? Well, if we take a look at the user info endpoint, it actually hints that the value is not used in the default implementation, which is the current one that we're using over here. It is for using in custom implementations of the onCreating ticket. What we've learned from the JWT video is that we can subscribe to events which happen in the authentication handler. Here, exactly the same thing happens. If we go to the OAuthHandler, and we are going to start from the beginning of handle remote authentication async, where we extract the state and we use the data protection API to unprotect it. We make sure that we've managed to successfully extract the properties. Then there is also a correlation ID. If we take a look inside, you're going to realize that it is just a cookie. Okay, we create this correlation ID cookie when we challenge, and then once we come back around, we still have it and we're able to load it up. So this is prevention against cross-site reference attacks. And sorry, I failed to come back because this is inside the remote authentication handler, which is a base class. So coming back to the authentication handler, against cross-site reference attacks, we validate this correlation ID, which is just a cookie. We then have this whole section around errors, which we don't really care that much about. We then have the code, which is the interesting bit. If you watch the OAuth video, you understand that this is our ticket to getting the access token. If we don't have it, something bad has happened. Finally, we exchange the code. Inside exchange the code, we forge a request. So this is what this looks like, which we then send through the back channel. Back channel is just an HTTP client. Okay, so we construct an HTTP request, send it through the back channel, and on the end of it, we get a response. We then do some kind of parsing on the response, and we get an auth token response, where we will be able to obtain an access token, token type, and refresh token if these are present. So by the end of, if I'm coming back over here to where we called the exchange code async, here we should have the tokens. If there were no errors, if we have the access token, all is good, otherwise emit an error. Finally, let's create a claims identity, and then we have the option to save tokens. Where do the tokens get saved? If indeed we do go to program and we call save tokens, right? And we set it to true. If we come back to AuthHandler, this block of code is going to get triggered. The access tokens will all get stored in this auth tokens list and then get added to the authentication properties. This is where we're going to take a quick pause and remind ourselves that the reason we're in the authentication handler is because we don't have any claims in our cookies, okay? We go through this auth authentication handler, by the end of which we get a cookie which doesn't have our claims. And then there is this option of saving tokens. And I'm just going to say it right here. If you specify that option to true, those tokens will get saved in the final cookie as well. And we're really here to see how this service takes whatever data and saves it in the final cookie that is being produced, okay? So for now, all we know is that this stuff gets saved in the properties. We then have the create ticket async, and here we have the creating ticket event being fired. Before this event gets fired, we have the auth creating ticket context, which contains the tokens, the back channel, so everything that we need to, enrich our claims principle that we have over here. Finally, once a creating ticket is called, we return success, all good. This whole function, and we will go into the event in just a second, the handle remote authenticate async gets called in the remote authentication handler, right over here. So this line of code is where the auth code on the callback path completes. We've exchanged the code for the token, we have all that contextual information bundled up in the authentication result. We then go further, do some error handling if any errors happen. We create that final ticket context. We do a little shuffling of parameters that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. We send an event, the ticket is received, and then finally we sign in as a sign-in schema. Remember that we've specified the sign-in schema to be the cookie sign-in schema. And from the cookie authentication video, we know what happens in the authentication handler when we sign in, okay? Because we've explored that option. Coming back to remote authentication handler, we sign in with that cookie where we're passing in the claims principle that we want to sign in is. This has been extracted from the token or, partially. And then properties, which if we specify the option for save tokens, this is where the tokens are going to be present, okay? In these properties. And again, if you need a refresher where they're being set, AuthHandler, let's scroll down here to where we have the save options block. On the properties, we have store tokens, and we're storing auth tokens result, where we're extracting every individual token from the tokens result, okay? We have the tokens, we store them in the authentication properties. Finally, we are signing in with the cookie authentication schema where we're using our claims principle and the authentication properties. Now, the important thing, and again, we're going to come back to add cookie, we're going to come back to the cookie authentication handler, and we're going to look for sign in async, because that is what we're doing over here. We're trying to handle sign in async. When we create the cookie sign in context, if we scroll a little bit down, we should find the append response cookie. This is the bit which is going to add the cookie value, which is going to be a string, to the response. The ticket over here is this authentication ticket, which contains the claims principle and the authentication properties. Your cookie is the properties and the claims principle combined together. So when we're signing in with the cookie authentication schema at the remote of authentication handler, we take the tokens and the authentication properties and the claims principle that we have, and we're putting it in the cookie. Later on in program CS, we can then go to HTTP context and call getToken async and grab something like an access token, where again, if we explore this option, so we're now coming around from another direction, we call getTokens on the authentication service. So getTokens, and here we have the authentication service where we try to authenticate. So this is going to trigger authentication. So it will load up your authentication context from the cookie or whatever it is, and it's going to get a token from the authentication properties. Okay, so the same value that it loads up the claims from the cookie by deserializing it, it does the same thing but deserializing the authentication properties out of that cookie. Perfect. Now that hopefully you're either clarified or completely confused, let's come back again to why we've started. We are trying to find out why we don't have any claims in our user session. We should have some knowledge now that we're going through this process, and I should speak a little bit more freely that if I find the code exchange, by the end of it we get tokens, and finally we're creating a ticket, by the end of which then gets returned to remote authentication handler that doesn't do anything with the token to create a claims principal. That, my friend, is up to you. You need to tell the Auth authentication handler how to parse that token into a claims principal, and that is the bit that we're going to take a look at right now. So if we go into Program CS, we're going to subscribe to the event that the Auth handler calls during create ticket. Here we have creating ticket, and this is going to call the onCreatingTicket function. Let's go to Program CS. We will go to events onCreatingTicket, and here we will assign a new context lambda. On the context lambda, we should have an access token. This access token, as part of the third step over here, we should exchange for user information with the user information endpoint that we have already set over here. Let's create our request. So request, a new HTTP request message. Semicolon over here, we're doing a get method, and then we have the context dot options and the user information endpoint. Having this request, we also have the access token, which we should attach to the request. So request headers, the authorization request. So new authentication header. Do not try to do this where you have bearer and then token. You can see first you have the schema, which refers to the authorization schema of the header or HTTP specification, not part of ASP.NET Core authentication schemas, okay? This is a different type of schema. So bearer authorization schema, we want to take the token and attach that as the value. So we will have authorization key value, colon, bearer space access token, okay, as part of the request. Once we have the request, we will go to the context, we will grab the back channel, and we will send async this request, right? So we're sending this request to GitHub. This will give us some kind of result. And by the way, I'm not sure why Microsoft is not doing this during its back channel extraction. So you can see here we have the request message and then also response. These are, or should be, from my experience, prepended with using to release resources. Or maybe I'm not aware of something. But finally, once we have the result, we can go to context and we should be able to read from JSON and just grab a JSON element. JSON element is a very generic thing, but this should be a user record. And this whole auth service is built to work with JSON elements, okay? And actually, let me not forget to wait over here and over here as well. If we quickly diverge again into the auth handler and we take a look at creating ticket async and auth creating ticket, inside of here you will have a run claims action function. So on the option, you're gonna have some claim actions. The purpose of this piece of code is it assumes that you're gonna make some kind of request to an endpoint to fetch user information, or that information may be in the access token. So you have two places where you can get user information. This piece of code basically says, look for these keys and map them to these claims, okay? And that's all this piece of logic is doing. The place where it extracts the keys or the claims is going to be a JSON element, this user data. So in Program CS, we want to go to the context and we want to run claim actions against this user object. The bit that we would be missing at this point are the claim actions. So before we add any of them, let's place a breakpoint over here, and we're going to take a look at what the user is, what the access token is, and we're going to have a little talk about it. With the application restarted, let's attach a debugger. I'm gonna come back to the browser and re-sign in, log in. I have content null exception. That's because I'm reading it from the request, not the result. So let's restart the application here. I will need to reattach the debugger. There we go. And let's log in again. And here we hit this point after obtaining the token and all of that. So for the access token value, this is what this looks like. Please notice auth spec does not say JWT anywhere. This is not a JSON web token. This is essentially a random string that is just an ID. It is a reference on GitHub's server. Later, we're going to be taking a look at creating our own auth server. So just understand that this is okay. We then just use this token to obtain user information. This is what our user information is going to look like. So let me open this up. The JSON object is over here in the middle. All we need to know that we have keys like login, which points to the username, and then another key like ID, which points to the user identifier. Let's load up the login and the ID into our claims object. For this, we'll need to create mappings. Let's just play this. Hopefully I'm not going to forget two words like login and ID. In O, we're going to find claims actions and we're going to add a claim action, or there is a convenience method where you can say map JSON key, where you're mapping it to a claim type from a key. Let's map it to a sub from ID. So sub is subject, and then we can do something a little bit more custom for the name or the username. Let's do like claims types. We'll take a Microsoft claim, why not? Grab the name and supply the login key. And there we go, the application has restarted. And by the way, if we refresh it right now, hopefully this is no surprise by now, we've not reobtained the cookie. We have the same old cookie that contains no claims. If you change the server side, the state in your browser doesn't change, okay? We can clear this, and if we go to login, we now have an authentication session with claims from GitHub. Perfect. Some big points to understand over here with the context. So if we go back to OAuthHandler, Auth Authentication Context, we will have the HTTP context assigned to the, let's go all the way to the base of this, to the HTTP context property, okay? So we can go to context, grab the HTTP context, request services, get database, put access token in the database against a user. So if you watched my authentication landscape video and you've seen how the token shouldn't be going in the browser, at the moment, if you choose the save tokens option, it's going to go in the cookies into the browser. If somebody gets the cookie, they're not going to be able to get the access token, but some things that you're not able to do if you put the access token in the browser is you're not able to watch over it. So let's say your user doesn't use your website for a month. Your cookie policy says 90 days. The access token says 15 minutes. You can keep using a refresh token to keep the token active if the tokens are stored on the backend. If you put them in the browser, your backend cannot keep those tokens alive. Okay, so if you want a better user experience, intercept the tokens, store them in your database, keep your cookies small, and keep your users' tokens alive for an appropriate amount of time. And that's pretty much all you need to know over there. If we search for Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication Facebook service, right? So let's add this, and with this package now added, we can go to add Facebook authentication. If we open it up, so add Facebook, go all the way down over here, we have Facebook options and Facebook handler. Can you guess what they inherit from? If you look in Facebook options, auth options, which set up everything that we've set up manually for GitHub, and all of the external authentication packages will do this for you, and you know now that you can override them just by extending either the options or configuring them. And Facebook extensions, Facebook handler, this extends the auth handler, which you can do as well if you have your own custom server with custom conventions, where you can customize how individual parts of the auth handler are going to work. Now that you've seen me do it, hopefully you're not scared to look through this code. You know that even though this function is maybe like 150 lines of code, it is not that scary. Load up the request, validate it, get the code, exchange it for the token, take the token, do some things with it. Otherwise, create a claims principal with the authentication properties, put that all in the cookie, deal out the cookie, use that cookie as the representation of your external authentication session. And this will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, click the notification bell. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. You can also leave a comment if you want to say thank you, but better yet, come support me on my Patreon, get the source code. Very big thank you to all of my patrons that are already supporting me. Again, thank you for watching the video and have a good day.